Well, good morning.
Yeah. Good morning, friends.
We're now on the second day. We've got a venti 2-pump soy extra foam latte. The keynote session has begun, and in crouching hidden dragon, we never realized how happy you make us. So Andy, well, you wrote the book Culture Making, and it blew us away. Oh Andy, technically Chachi did not read it, but I heard that it's great. Oh Andy.
You know, it really is a great book, and I mean, I really think you should read it. So,
Makes me wish the I could read.
hey guys, let's not bleep it when he says heck.
I said
Okay, that's hilarious, guys. Okay, let's do the key change.
We'll need a palate cleanser after that. Thank you, video guys. Well, I'm glad to be here. I bring you greetings from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, a strange foreign land where men occasionally tuck in their shirts. And as I came to this conference, I found myself anxious about something. I noticed that the Echo Conference is for geeks, artists, and storytellers. And I found myself worrying that I would not have sufficient credibility as a geek with this extremely geeky audience. This is something that has never happened before to me at Christian conferences. I never worry about being not geeky enough, usually. This is the first time, but I thought, okay, geeks are known, what are we known for? For lots of obscure knowledge that we care passionately about, have passionate opinions about, right? So I thought just to establish my geek credibility, I would just quickly run you through some of the things I have passionate opinions about. 37 signals, Comic Sans, RESTful APIs, one fellow RESTful API lover, Final Cut Pro X, Edward Tufte's The Visual Display of Quantitative Information, and the geekiest thing I could think of, which I actually don't have much of an opinion about, THX 1138. And if you get that, we're both in a lot of trouble. So now to cleanse our palate from that, I thought I'd give you a song. The sun came up, it was blue and gold. The sun came up, it was blue and gold. The sun came up, it was blue and gold. Ever since I saw your picture in a frame, I come calling in my Sunday best. I come calling in my Sunday best. I come calling in my Sunday best. Ever since I put your picture in a frame, I'm gonna love you till the wheels fall off. Oh yeah. The sun came up, it was blue and gold. The sun came up, it was blue and gold. The sun came up, it was blue and Ever since I put your picture in a frame. I'm gonna love you till the wheels fall off. Oh, yeah. The sun came up, it was blue and gold. The sun came up, it was blue and gold. The sun came up, it was blue and gold. Ever since I put your picture in a frame. The sun came up, it was blue and gold. Ever since I put your picture in a frame. Thank you. Now, turn to your neighbor and talk about two things, two questions. Talk with your neighbor about just for a minute or two. Number one, what is that song about? I know it's about love, but beyond that, what is that song about? And if you run out of things to say about that, though you shouldn't, talk about this second question. What makes that an excellent song? So what's it about, and what makes it an excellent song? Just turn to one or two neighbors and talk about that for a moment. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes with you talking about excellence. What makes works of creativity excellent? So this talk is about the ingredients of excellence. And we'll come back to Tom Waits at the end, but I thought we'd actually spend the bulk of our time on one of the most extraordinary movies about excellence and creativity ever made. I think probably the most extraordinary one made in the last 10 years. If I were to talk about ever made, I'd have to talk about Babette's Feast and maybe a couple others. But in the last 10 years, the best movie anyone has made about creativity is the Pixar film Ratatouille. Now, if you have not seen the movie Ratatouille, you have two choices, because I'm going to completely spoil it for you in the next half an hour. So you could quietly slip out now. Some of you do not have children, and so you're under the impression that somehow you shouldn't be watching Pixar movies. Oh, you are so wrong. Pixar is doing the most extraordinarily, highly creative, highly excellent work of any major studio right now. And it's a fascinating coincidence, or perhaps not, that it's the only major studio producing feature films that has a number of Christ followers in senior positions of leadership. Andrew Stanton, the writer-director of Finding Nemo and WALL-E, Pete Docter, writer-director of Up, a number of others who aren't quite as public with their faith but are very much devoted Christians. And isn't it interesting that this studio consistently, except for Cars, produces incredible movies that break all kinds of boundaries. 20 minutes dialogue-free at the beginning of a children's movie, that's the beginning of WALL-E. Has anyone ever dared to do that? A movie about aging for children? That's what Up is. Pixar over and over has delivered extraordinarily creative work, and we need to study what they're doing if we're going to hope to be creative ourselves. But my favorite Pixar movie is this movie Ratatouille. And I want to explain to you why it's my favorite. And in order to do that, I have to get extremely geeky for about 15 minutes. because I want to talk about the structure of a story. What is it that makes a story work? And here I'm drawing on the work of a French structuralist named A.J. Gréma. He's quoted in a doctoral dissertation by Richard Hayes that I read a number of years ago. And I found this structure very illuminating. Here's how Gréma sees story. He says every story is driven, it has a kind of an engine. It's driven by a sender that wants to deliver something, we'll call it the object, to a receiver. The fundamental engine of story is a quest to get the object from the sender to the receiver. And in order to accomplish this quest, the sender sends someone. Perhaps the iPhone is working momentarily. The sender sends someone. He sends what we call the subject. And the subject is what we traditionally call the hero of the story or the protagonist of the story. So the sender is not the protagonist. The sender is more like a kind of quasi-godlike figure, sometimes off stage entirely, but still very present and necessary for the story. So in The Lord of the Rings, what's the object? This is like first grade story analysis. The object in The Lord of the Rings is the ring. The subject who has to deliver the ring to its destination is Frodo. The sender is Gandalf, I guess we would say. But Gandalf really acts sort of instead of some larger benevolent force in the world of The Lord of the Rings. There's this kind of offstage force of goodness that's seeking to take the ring to its receiver, which is Mount Doom, right? And the essential question of the story is, how will the subject get the object to the receiver? How will this quest be accomplished? In the course of this quest unfolding, the iPhone has stopped working again. I'm just going to put it in my pocket and rely on my elf named Jonathan. In the course of the story, the subject finds that he or she is encountering all kinds of opposition, and so there's two other forces or characters that come into the story: the helpers and the opponents. So in the quest to accomplish what the sender has asked, the subject encounters obstacles, and those obstacles are set up by opponents, and if the subject overcomes them, he or she can only overcome them with the help of some helpers, some characters that come alongside and make it possible. In Disney animated movies, not thankfully in Pixar, the helper is always a small animated creature who makes funny jokes. All right? But fortunately, Pixar is more creative than that. So, how does this work with Ratatouille? Let's walk through it. And as we go, you'll get the sense of what the story is about. Ratatouille is about a rat named Remy. Remy is an unusual rat. He has a love of fine cuisine. He wants to cook. He wants to introduce his whole family to fine cuisine rather than the garbage they usually eat. In the wonderful scene, his father eating, and his father says, he's complaining about the food. His father says, "Shut up and eat your garbage." Right? Remy doesn't want to just eat garbage. He says, "I want to be like a human." There's something about human beings. They're creative. They invent things. By the way, every Pixar movie is actually secretly about what is it to be a human being. Even when they have little furry creatures, they're actually about what is it to be a human being. So Remy is a rat who wants to be a cook. How has this happened? How has Remy acquired this vision? Well, it's because of this kind of godlike character whose name is Auguste Gusteau, who's a famous French in Paris. And Gusteau, who at the beginning of the movie is already dead, in this way he's kind of that godlike off-camera sender figure. We hope at the beginning of Ratatouille will somehow find a way to use Remy to deliver fine cuisine to rat kind. So we can bring that up on the next slide. All right, so this is the basic structure of Act 1 of Ratatouille. How will Remy convince his family that they ought to be eating good food rather than garbage? Now, in this quest, Remy has some opponents. Who are his opponents? Well, the great irony of Act 1 is his opponents are his own family. His father, who couldn't care less what he eats, and Emile, who couldn't care less what he eats for another reason, his brother, who's just a glutton. So his father, who's sort of indifferent to food, Emile, who cares so much for food that he doesn't care enough about excellence in food, right? And these are Remy's opponents. They frustrate him. In fact, what he ends up doing is just checking for poison. Now, pause. Is this not a parable for Christian creativity, my friends? Isn't this a parable? That the people who have been gifted with great creative abilities often end up feeling like all we're supposed to do is just make culture safe for people. We're like cultural poison checkers, that all the culture we create has to somehow be safe for the whole family, which is on billboards advertising Christian music all over this part of the world, I think. Is that all we're meant to do? Act 1 of Ratatouille says that's not all creators are meant to do, just to make culture safe for people. Because actually great culture is rarely safe for people. So, here's how Act 1 ends. It ends in failure, ends in frustration, because, you notice the blank section where the helper should be? Remy has no helper. Act 1 ends with the failure of his dreams to bring fine cuisine to Ratkind, because no one is there to help him accomplish it, and he has these very powerful opponents, his father and his brother, and the whole clan of rats who really don't care. So Act 1 ends, and in every good story, Act 1 always ends in frustration. So that is what leads us to Act 2. In Act 2, Remy is going to become the receiver. Remy needs something at the end of Act 1 that he doesn't have. And so in Act 2, Gusteau, the sender, is going to have to deliver to Remy something that he doesn't currently have, namely the opportunity to actually cook. Remy needs an opportunity to be a chef. How is a rat ever going to get the opportunity to be a chef? That's the question with which Act 1 ends and Act 2 begins. And so in Act 2, Remy, the subject of Act 1, this is where it gets really technical, so hang with me, all right? This is like graduate level stuff, so, flatter yourselves. At the end of Act 1, the subject of Act 1 is transferred to become the receiver of Act 2, because without being given something that the subject does not possess in Act 1, there's no way for the subject to carry out their original quest. And that's why we need Act 2, to give Remy what he's missing. What is he missing? He's missing an opportunity. Who will Gusteau send to be Remy's opportunity? Does anyone know who saw the movie? Linguini. Linguini is a hapless washer boy who has a big tall hat, and it turns out that Remy can sit inside Linguini's hat and cook, give him directions about how to cook. Linguini himself can't cook, but he's sent into Remy's life in order to make up the lack that Remy had, which is that no one's ever going to let a rat in the kitchen, but they'll let a rat in the kitchen if he's under someone else's hat. So in Act 2, Remy is provided what he needs. He ends up working in a 4-star kitchen. Right? And Linguini now, as the subject, is going to have opponents and helpers. So I forget which order these come in, but bring something up. Oh, yes. So who's his helper? It's the very experienced only woman in the kitchen, Colette. All right? I am so glad to put a woman on screen, because this is a rather male-dominated story and event, I might add. And I apologize, but Colette plays a very important role, and she's not someone to trifle with. So she's a real, not a helper in the least sense of the word, but a helper in the greatest sense of the word for Linguini in the story. She helps Linguini figure out the rules of the kitchen, but there is also an opponent, the wonderfully named Chef Skinner, which clues you in that he's not a very good chef. And Chef Skinner is implacably opposed to Linguini and what he suspects is going on under Linguini's hat. And that's how Act 2 is kind of balanced. Linguini is providing opportunity to Remy, Skinner is opposing him, Colette is helping him. So now we're ready for Act 3. And Graymoss says a very interesting thing. He says this basic structure of story is always repeated 3 times. And in the third act, the situation of the first act is recapitulated. It comes back. But now, all the ingredients are in place for the quest to actually be fulfilled. So think about Lord of the Rings for a moment. How does Act 1 end in Lord of the Rings? Happens to be the end of the first movie. Well, I'm thinking of the dissolution of the Fellowship, although you're thinking, right? The Fellowship is broken. The helpers who have come alongside Frodo are now gone. Sam and Frodo have to go off on their own, right? So Act 1 ends in failure. Act 2 ends when all the pieces are in place for the quest actually to be fulfilled. So that's what happens in Act 3. But here is where Ratatouille becomes not just a good movie, but a great movie. What happens in Act 3? Well, Remy is back in the role of subject. What is going to happen? See, without my little presenter notes, I'm as interested as you are in what's going to come up on the screen next. The original quest is going to be fulfilled. the thing that was laid out in Act 1 as the original quest is actually going to happen. Gusteau is going to inspire Remy to provide cuisine for Ratkind. However, Remy is going to need some helpers, perhaps? Yes, Linguini. And now he's got the opportunity he needs. So now, see, he has the helpers he didn't have in Act 1. But in a wonderful twist, his family moves. They convert from being opponents to being helpers, right? However, Act 3 introduces a crucial complication in the plot because Remy is now opposed not only by Chef Skinner, who's been the enemy all along, but by a new character, the fearsome food critic, Anton Ego. Anton Ego has never met a restaurant he likes. He destroys careers, including Gusteau's, with his critical reviews. He is, by the way, a parable of people who the only thing they know to do with culture is criticize it. I don't like food. I love it. You know, I think our culture often thinks this is how Christians relate to culture. We don't like culture, we love it. We love it so much we hate it. But we don't ever show that we just love culture. I think Anton Ego is a warning to us of what happens when you become just a critic. Anton Ego is just a critic. And this introduces a tremendous complication in Act 3. Because just at the moment when it seems like Remy's going to fulfill his quest through the agency of Linguini with the help of his family, Anton Ego comes for dinner and demands to be served something that will meet his high expectations. And we have every reason to believe Anton Ego will be disappointed. And then comes, I'm now about to completely spoil the movie for you, so sorry, it came out in 2007, you had your chance. And it's still really good, even if you know what's going to happen. Because I can tell you what's going to happen, but I can't give you the moment the way the film does. Because Remy cooks up a dish called ratatouille, one of the simplest dishes in the kitchen. And he serves it to Anton Ego, and it unlocks in Anton Ego a memory of love. A memory of a time when he was a little boy with a broken bicycle. And suddenly, Anton Ego is no longer a critic, but is overcome with the goodness of the world, the goodness of his story back before he became a bitter, bent person. He drops his pen, ceases to be a critic, and becomes a lover of food. It's one of the most amazing conversion moments in any story that I can think of on screen. And amazingly, then, they followed up with a typically Pixar-esque, just unbelievable, how did they convince themselves they could do this moment? Because what follows is a 4-minute essay on the role of the critic in culture, delivered in voiceover by Anton Ego, voiced by the wonderful Peter O'Toole. And in a children's movie, in the middle of a children's movie, we have the most sophisticated assessment of what is the role of critics in creativity. And Anton Ego says, the real role of the critic is to articulate and defend what's new, to give to other people the courage to try something new. And he says, tonight I got to try something new, and it's rocked me to my core. I'm different now, I'm changed. If you watch this movie with other people, you will find that the moment when Anton Ego converts is the highlight of the film. It's the emotional center of the film. Because what happens in that moment is Anton Ego moves, right, from being the opponent of Remy and Linguini and Colette and company to being the helper. Did you see that expensively produced keynote transition? Anton Ego converts from being the opponent to the helper. Why is this the climax of the movie? The secret is in his name. So Anton, that's clear enough, right? Antagonist. He's the antagonistic principle. He's the opponent in the story. Oh, by the way, did you notice what he said to Linguini? You've been playing without an opponent, which, as you may have guessed, is against the rules. The rules. What? Rules of what? The rules of story. We instinctively know that gains that are won without opposition are not real gains. That if you win without an opponent, you haven't won. They just forfeited. We demand from our stories real opposition because our experience of life is real opposition to the quests that we're on, the things we feel called to seek. And so to have a story without an opponent is to have a story that doesn't ring true, doesn't feel right. And so when Anton Ego says, you've been playing it without an opponent, it's against the rules. He's just articulating what every human being knows. If you don't have an opponent, a credible, real opponent in your story, you don't have a story at all. And I'm going to make all these little pauses and parentheses here, but how often do Christians tell a kind of truncated story that doesn't do justice to the real opposition in the world? And the real opposition in ourselves, because what's Anton Ego's last name? Ego. Who is Anton Ego? Anton Ego is me. Who is the critic who is never satisfied with anything that I create? My ego, me, that little voice inside me that John talked about last night that says, that wasn't good enough. I'm not swallowing that. I don't like culture. I love it. Can't you do better than that? I've never met a piece of culture I was willing to swallow. Nothing you made anyway. It's the voice of the inner critic. And all of us know, if we're honest about our own creativity, that by far the greatest opposition to creating what we were meant to create does not come from some outside force like Chef Skinner, or even from real critics we may have. It comes from inside us. The reason I don't create what I was meant to create is not anything outside me, it's myself. My book, Culture Making, is for sale out there, and I hope you'll buy it and optionally read it. But that book was due in 2005, and it wasn't turned in until the end of 2007. It was turned in 2 years, 9 months late because of my own Anton Ego. That bent part of me that just told me every time I sat down to write, you can't do that, you idiot. That told me some really smart person is going to read your book and think it's stupid, which actually did happen after it was published. For 2.5 years, I avoided writing that book because of my own opposition to what I knew I was called by God to do. What we all want to believe is that this part of us that's our inner critic could convert from being our opponent to being our helper. That actually that critic could go from frustrating everything we do, preventing us from ever getting started on what we know we're meant to do, to a real ally. Because actually to create great work, you need an inner critic. You need something in you that isn't just kind of, you need a Simon Cowell, right? You know? Someone who, if you know you're singing for that person, it better be good, right? You don't just need Paula Abdul, right? Isn't she always the friendly one, right? We all need our Paula Abduls, but to be great, you've got to have a Simon Cowell. And so we all hope that that inner voice that currently just prevents us from creating one day could become our helper and could help us actually create the greatest thing we're capable of creating. And that's why, at the moment when Anton Ego converts, this movie goes from being a wonderfully produced, lovely children's movie to being a deep, profound parable of what it is to be a human being. And that's why we react so overwhelmingly, even emotionally, to that moment when Anton Ego changes sides, because we are all hoping for the conversion of the opponent. What's great about this movie, then? Well, let's count the ways. I wonder what will come up on the screen next. Oh, yes. Here's an interesting thing. So we have the conversion. Remy's family joins him. Ego eventually joins them. But there's another interesting thing about this movie. It ends with a happier ending than you ever had any right to expect, because Remy ends up not just fulfilling the original quest, which was to get his family to eat good food, but he ends up feeding human beings. Now, who has ever heard of a rat who can get away with serving food to human beings? But that's what happens in the magical world in the movie, right? In other words, the ending is way happier than you could have predicted at the beginning. These two things, the conversion of the opponent and what I'd call the happier ending, are what distinguish great stories from formulaic stories. In a formulaic story, for example, the movie Maid of Honor, which I was subjected to on a plane flight a few years ago. 2 hours of my life I will never have back. At the end of Act 1 of Maid of Honor and every other formulaic romantic comedy, you know exactly what's going to happen at the end of Act 3. Because you know it's going to be a happy ending because that's the formula, right? And that's true in Pixar too, by the way. Pixar never unloads Ingmar Bergman on you, where it just sort of ends down and everyone dies, and, right? We aren't going to do that to our kids, right? So you watch a romantic comedy, you know it's going to end happily, but at the end of Act 1, you know exactly how it's going to end happily and how happily it will end. You know that the stupid, loutish guy who she really shouldn't be chasing anyway, as near as I can tell, is eventually going to come around from his self-centered ways and embrace intimacy and romance, blah, blah, blah. I mean, my gosh, you know that after 5 minutes after the establishing meet cute scene. You're like, okay, got it. And indeed, that's exactly what happens in Maid of Honor, and nothing else happens of significance for 2 hours. That's a bad movie. It's a bad story because nothing unexpected happens. There's no opponent in that story who converts. By the way, stories often have both an enemy and an opponent. I hope you're anticipating the theological significance of all this, which I'm going to get to. I do realize this is a Christian event, so we will get to some Christian points here. There's often an enemy who doesn't convert. That's Chef Skinner. The only thing you can do with the enemy at the end of the story is, well, what happened to Chef Skinner is he's bound and cast into the outer darkness, or actually the inner darkness of the restaurant's walk-in refrigerator. All you can do with the enemy is just kind of eliminate the enemy at the end of the story. But the opponent is a figure that begins in opposition and ends as a helper, ends as an ally. That's one mark of greatness. The other is a happier ending. An ending that not only ends happily, but ends more happily than you ever could have anticipated, and you never could have anticipated how it would end happily. At the end of Act 1, when Remy's attempt to bring fine cuisine to his family has totally backfired, they're all now washed down a sewer pipe, literally. At the end of Act 1, you could never predict, if I shut the movie off at that moment, no one who was watching that movie for the first time could tell you how it was going to end. That's a great story. It has a happier ending. Not a happy ending, a happier ending. All right, so let's go back to the structure of a story. Let's look at how this fits with the gospel just for a moment. Let's see what happens here. Is that slide going? Oh, yes, there it is. Remember the structure? Why is this the structure of a story? Why is this what every human being expects when they sit down to watch a movie or sit down even just to tell a friend a tale of what happened to them at the mall? It's because this is the structure of the cosmos. What is our story, human beings' story? It's that there is a sender, the creator of the world, who wishes to deliver something to a receiver. What is the object? What is the receiver? Well, according to Genesis, what God wishes is that the world that he's created, this beautiful, fruitful, abundant earth, will be filled with his image bearers, with his image, that his image bearers will be fruitful and multiply. That's what God is sending into the world at the climax of creation, sending his image into the whole world. That's the sender sending the object to the receiver. Who is he sending? He's sending his own image bearers. We human beings are the subject of the story. But Act 1 of the story as it's told in the Bible ends in frustration. Why? Because we have an opponent, but no helper. We have an opponent. In the garden is the voice of opposition, saying, that's not a very good story. We can make up a better one. You don't want to be related to that creator God, right? So Act 1 of the biblical story ends in frustration. What happens in Act 2? Well, what has to happen in every Act 2? The original subject has to receive something. The original subject can't accomplish their quest with what they were originally given. They've messed it up. Everything's been lost at the end of Act 1. In Act 2, a new subject enters the story whose job is to deliver something that we could not acquire on our own. And that's the sending of the incarnate image of God, the incarnate Son of God, who comes into the story, delivers to us the redemption and sanctification that we need to fulfill what we were meant to be, right? And then in Act 3, what's Act 3? Well, it's a happier ending. It's a happier ending because it doesn't just, see, if it were a formulaic story, You would read through the first few chapters of Genesis, and I would tell you, well, believe it or not, this story is going to have a happy ending. And you would say, oh, they're going to go back to the garden, and everything will be kind of rewound to the way it ought to have been. That is not the way the abundant, creative God works. Because what actually happens in Act 3 of our story, an act that has not been fully played out yet, is that not only are God's image bearers restored to their image-bearing capacity, and not only is the earth filled again with genuine image bearing, but the entire cosmos, Paul tells us, has been groaning for this to happen. So something happens in the structure of the whole universe in the culmination of this story that is far greater than anything that was happening in some little garden, in some little corner of an early formed world. And what is in this new cosmos? Not just a garden, but a city. A city that has the culmination of every possible act of human creativity. Every creative act of God's image bearers is represented in some way. This is the story that human beings are hungry for because it's the one true story. This is why, by the way, you can play this little game of look for the Christ figure in a movie. Oh, I think, so-and-so is the Christ figure in this movie. I got news for you. In every good movie, there's a Christ figure. Like every single one. There isn't like one group of movies that have Christ figures. Every movie has some incarnation of someone who comes into the story to provide what the original set of characters could not accomplish on their own. Because otherwise, people will not be satisfied with it as a story. Now, some movies are bad, and so in Maid of Honor, I don't know that there is a Christ figure in Maid of Honor, and that's its problem. Let me illustrate this another way. Johann Sebastian Bach died on the 28th of July. This is his greater birthday, the day he was born into a greater life, the glory that he anticipated his whole life. On the 28th of July in 1750, he ended this life and began a greater one. And Bach had an ability to tell stories, tell the same kind of story in music. How does this work? He takes something very, very simple. These are the 4 chords you have to know, 3 chords you have to know to be a worship guitarist, right? If you want, you can throw in 6 minor. That's what comes next, and then 2 minor. And now you've got, most of the body of Western worship music since 1980. That wasn't fair. Bach takes this incredibly simple thing, and he says, if we just play this much, it's not a story. This is like Act 1, that little chord change. Okay, it went somewhere. I didn't just sit there, but it didn't go far enough, right? So Bach says, in order to make music out of this very simple figure, I've got to take it further. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to gradually add complexity. I'm going to add, first, just the slightest bit of dissonance. This is the relative minor to the dominant, the tonic chord. It's not very much, but as we go, I'm going to introduce a little more dissonance as we go. Here comes the first really dissonant moment. The 7 and the 8 right next to each other. And what I'm going to do is unfold a story in music that takes you on a journey. This journey is going to take you further and further into dissonance. Do you hear how it's getting further and further away from the home key? It's getting more complex, and we're coming up on the absolutely most dissonant moment of the whole piece. But not before we have a little temporary resolution here, but here it comes. 7th, the major 7th. Now we're going to have a diminished, and then we have something that isn't a chord at all. Whoops, I played it wrong. Very dissonant chord, but when it's played out as part of the whole story, it isn't quite as dissonant. Let me play it again for you because I messed it up. Listen to how this dissonance fits into the whole piece. And now what Bach is going to do in kind of Act 3 of this piece is bring you back to the home chord that you've been away from for so long, not without adding additional dissonance, but eventually inviting you to a new realization of that original chord. And when you end up at that home chord, you are not where you started. It's the same chord, it's just a C. But it's not the same. Why? Let's collate the ingredients of excellence, because I'm running out of time. What are the ingredients of excellence here? A happier ending. Is the culture that you're creating offering people a glimpse of something glorious beyond what they could naturally expect? Because that's what God offers the world. And that's what the best culture offers the world. The best culture doesn't just deliver sort of expected resolutions. It takes you so far from the expected into so much chaos, dissonance, even real noise, that when you come home, it's a happier ending. An ending you could neither predict how happy it would be nor how it would happen. There's another thing about Bach and Pixar and Tom Waits that makes them excellent, and that's what I call the full catastrophe. This is a phrase I got from a molecular biologist named Jon Kabat-Zinn. I think I'll stand up to tell this part. When my wife was pregnant with our first child, our son Timothy, she got sciatica in her back. Sciatica is when a nerve in your spinal column is compressed. It's the nerve that connects to your leg. Some of you have experienced this. And when that nerve gets compressed, it generates tremendous shooting pain, sometimes all the way down your leg. I had this happen to me a couple years ago, and my doctor gave me steroids, which was the most extraordinarily delicious, wonderful experience of my life. Woo! Like, wow, I've never done drugs. This is pretty close. You can't do that when you're pregnant. You can't even take aspirin or ibuprofen, right? Because that little baby can't deal with that stuff. So what do you do to manage tremendous, debilitating pain that you know, this started in about month 4, so you know you can count the days. You've got 5 months of debilitating pain ahead of you. What do? The only thing we found that helped were the techniques that were developed by Jon Kabat-Zinn, who teaches medicine at the University of Massachusetts. And he works with people with chronic pain. And he teaches them how to live with tremendous pain. And it's the most odd thing that he teaches. Because what he teaches is the way to live with tremendous pain is to focus on the pain. This is exactly contrary to every instinct of every human being. When we're in pain, we tend to try to get away from it. We tend to try to escape it. If we have chemical options to escape it, whether prescription or not, we choose them. But Kabat-Zinn says the only way to deal with long-term chronic pain is what he calls to experience the full catastrophe. He has a book called Full Catastrophe Living. He's a Buddhist, by the way, so just in case you go read that book and you think, oh my gosh, Andy Crouch recommended a Buddhist. Yes, I did. Because this was the only thing that got Catherine through this, and that has gotten me through some experiences of chronic pain as well. Full catastrophe. Most human beings try to avoid the full catastrophe. Most bad art tries to avoid the full catastrophe. But the human story is not just everything's so pleasant here in Texas. The human story is dissonance. And worse. And great art always acknowledges the full catastrophe. In other words, if Bach had written even this is the simplest thing in the Well-Tempered Clavier, but if he had written this without that dissonance, it wouldn't have been done. It would not have been great. Is the media that we're creating, the music we're making, the films we're shooting, the stories we're writing, do they do justice to the full catastrophe? Two other things, and then I want to go back to Tom Waits. Isn't it amazing that this incredibly innovative creative company, Pixar, remains absolutely faithful to the form of story? An ingredient of excellence is faithfulness to the form. Great works do not break all or even most of the rules. This is perhaps the most common misunderstanding of beginning culture makers. They think, oh, I don't need to learn all those rules. There are people who think they can play the piano without playing Bach first. No. You have to be faithful to the form. You have to learn this stuff. Before you can go improvise, you need to do scales until your head starts to hurt and your family threatens to throw you out of the house. Because until you're able to be faithful to the form of the 12-tone scale, the rhythms of 4 and 3 and 6 and all those things, you aren't ready to create. Pixar completely respects the form of story. And the word I end up using for this in my book is cultivating. It's taking care of what's already good in the world. Our creativity should deeply respect the forms that have been handed on to us. So if you're a musician and you haven't played the works of Bach, start playing the works of Bach. It's not too late. If you're a filmmaker and you haven't watched every one of the films of Ingmar Bergman, that really depressing person who would never be hired at Pixar, and you haven't broken them down scene by scene, act by act, seen how he does his shots, what are you doing? Go watch Ingmar Bergman. Don't even go to the rest of Echo. Just go home, it's probably on YouTube or whatever. Start watching, because until you know that form, you will not create excellence. You'll just create very derivative, imitative work. But then, both Pixar and Bach innovate in form as well. They not only respect form, but they innovate, which is why Pixar has this crazy thing of this food critic who comes in kind of at the last moment in the story and then converts. Why? Because this is our God. This is not sort of made up ideas. This is the way God is. God is a creator of order and abundance. He creates room for creation, but then within the order of creation, he invites his creatures to team and to fill the earth with all kinds of unexpected things. All right, now let's talk about Tom Waits, because I've tested your patience long enough. The sun came up, it was blue and gold. Let's put those lyrics up and look at them for a second. What makes this a great song? I think it's a great song. And I know it is because Eddie Vedder covered it, so it has to be a great song. I actually learned it from Willie Nelson, who also covered it, and if Willie Nelson covers it, it's a great song. What makes this a great song? Well, not the quantity of its lyrics, right? It's only got like 6 total lines. What makes it great is a couple things. First of all, we have to settle, what is it about? What is this song about? The sun came up, it was blue and gold. Ever since I put your picture in a frame. What the heck is he talking about? Did anyone have any guesses? Shout it out. Death. When is one of the times we put pictures in a frame? At the moment of the full catastrophe. When our loved one is taken away from us, all we have left is a picture, and we put the picture in a frame. This song is about a funeral. When do you come calling in your Sunday best? Not on Sunday, right? You don't get up on Sunday and say, I'm putting on my Sunday best, because, not in our churches anymore. Now Sunday best is like, I think I'll wear my cleaner flip-flops, but back in the day, right? You don't put on your Sunday best on Sunday. You put it on, when you say, I'm putting on my Sunday best, you're putting it on for a special occasion that's not Sunday, right? I come calling. When do you come calling in Southern culture? When there's been a death. So this song is about loss. It's about death. It's about a funeral. What else is it about? Love. Specifically. Eternal love. That's the Jesus answer. When's the other time you put on your Sunday best? Weddings. It's about a wedding. And it's about a funeral. It's about both. This song is actually about both weddings and funerals. Specifically, I think what it's about what happens when you get married. And you look at your beloved, and when you say those words, in my service it was, I, Andrew, take thee, Catherine, to be my wife, to have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poor, in sickness and in health, until we are parted by death. And you look into the face of your beloved and you realize, I am going to live until the death of one of us with this person. And death becomes real for you. And the implication of death for your love becomes real at that moment in a way that it has never been before in your life. So this song is about the stereotypical happy ending of the romantic comedy, right? It always ends with the wedding. But this is about what happens at the moment when that stereotypical happy ending happens, the wedding moment, and you realize, oh, now I'm entering into the full catastrophe of life with another human being. And one of us, both of us in a way, will experience that full catastrophe. That's what makes the bridge so important. I'm going to love you till the wheels fall off, right? That's what tells you it's not just a funeral song, because it would be a little awkward to sing that to your corpse, right? The wheels have fallen off. Now, you sing this at the beginning when you've made that vow, and you say, okay, I'm this committed. I'm committed to the full catastrophe with you. Now, next slide. Tom Waits wrote another verse. I love you, baby, and I always will. Oh, yeah. Ever since I put you got the idea. Willie Nelson cut that verse. Why did Willie Nelson cut that verse? It's completely superfluous. In fact, think about this. I love you, baby, and I always will. That's a pickup line, or that's like third date, maybe? It's like when you're trying to get the girl to go to the next step, And the proper response to, I love you, baby, and I always will, is you ought to put a ring on it, right? Yeah. So ladies, when that wonderful man who has not yet made any actual promises to you says, I love you, baby, and I always will. Oh, yeah. You say, come back when you've paid a visit to the jeweler, because it's completely, if you are saying, the sun came up, it was blue and gold. What is that if not the combination of the ultimate glory and the ultimate sadness, the happiest ending and the fullest catastrophe, gold and blue, blue and gold. I come calling in my Sunday best. I've put your picture in a frame. You do not have to say, I love you, baby, and I always will. You're saying it with every other word of the song, which is why Willie Nelson's version is the most excellent, because it eliminates what's not necessary. And that's the last ingredient of excellence. The greatest works of art eliminate what isn't necessary. And Tom Waits did it. And he taught us today something about love and marriage. I don't know if I'd trust Tom Waits to do teaching on a whole sermon series on love and marriage or any other aspect of moral behavior. But he wrote a song that artistically for us gives us a hint of that happiest ending, because how can you sing this song if you don't intimate, have some hint of resurrection? How can you sing this song if you're not aware of the full catastrophe of life? This formally very respectful song, it respects the blues form so closely, A-A-A-B. But it's also formally innovative in one way. Let me just show it to you. Sun came up, it was blue and gold. Ever since I put your picture in a frame. They did something there. It was these 4 notes. It adds a measure to the standard blues form. Let me sing the verse for you. Just listen to how this innovates. The sun came up, it was blue and gold. The sun came up, it was blue and gold. The sun came up, it was blue and gold. Now, there's a little pause there. It lengthens it. It stretches it out. It says, listen. And that's what great art does. So, I've taken a lot of your time. I've kept you from lunch. But I hope that I've given you some pictures of what excellence looks like. And I'd like us to end with a song that does it all. This is a song written by the British hymn writer Isaac Watts. And yes, I see laptops closing, and that's exactly the right thing to do because I'm going to ask you to stand and sing and worship in a moment. What does Isaac Watts do in this song we're about to sing? Well, he takes an absolutely fixed form. He takes a psalm, and he innovates with it, but in a way that's completely faithful to the psalm. What does he do in this song? He gives us a vision of the happier ending that's waiting for us. He also acknowledges the full catastrophe of life. And he does it all in the absolutely simplest words so that you'll see when we get to the end, the last line we'll sing is entirely words of a single syllable that say everything we need to say about who we want to be, who God will be for us, who really is the hero of the story. It's excellent. And my benediction for you would just be, you can do this. You can create things this good. Let's create things this good. Now I hope we'll have the words here and we'll sing it together. My shepherd will supply my need. Jehovah is his name. In pastures fresh, he makes me feed beside the living stream. He brings my wandering spirit back when I forsake his ways, and leads me for his mercy's sake in paths of truth and grace. I want you to really know this, so we're going to sing just those last 2 lines again. He brings my wandering spirit back, just so we all have the tune in our heads and in our hearts, and then we'll go on. He brings my wandering spirit back when I forsake his ways, and leads me for his mercy's sake in paths of truth and grace. When I walk through the shades of death, thy presence is my stay. One word of thy supporting breath drives all my fears away. Thy hand in sight of all my foes doth still my table spread. my cup with blessing overflows. Thine oil anoints my head. The sure provisions of my God attend me all my days. Oh, may thy house be mine abode, and all my work be praised. There would I find a settled rest while others go and come. No more a stranger or a guest, but like a child at home. Amen, and thank you.